those. So I guess, starting with, how we would guarantee long-term affordability. If people have thoughts, I would love to hear it. I'm gonna, maybe I'll just call on people. So, Stu, you want to go first?
I don't know that I have the silver bullet on that one. The market forces are pretty much a beast that none of us, I don't know of any policy that can actually control that. So there are sharper minds on that topic in the room than I.
I think part of the issue is not mechanically how you control long-term affordability. I think some of the nuanced question is, what role does long-term affordability have here? So you may have different audiences that are interested in saying, we're going to build a cheaper product. And then you're going to have audiences that are going to say, we're going to build a product that is affordable in perpetuity. And those are two different things. So in Hood River, in the past 20 years, 99% of the housing has been built by the market, with select exceptions where the city and or the housing authority has come in and interjected. So I think we need to be mindful as we go forward. I'm going to assume that the vast majority of housing is going to be built by the private sector. How do we consider some of those long-term affordability goals also tempered by maybe what is palatable and feasible by people who are doing this for profit or for a return, if not profit? I think that's part of that long-term affordability conversation that council gets to grapple with. But if you have any enlightened perspectives from the room, I think we're open to hear if you had any thoughts or feelings or emotions on that.
Nate, you're muted.
This, I think, is ultimately where we leverage our local groups, Kenny and some of the other outfits, and most importantly, for some aspect of it, the housing trust model. We do get that opportunity to build a different. I think the thing is what we need to look at, and I think that the council already understood this with the middle housing, is we need to have a variety of product out there, right? I mean, there's a varied market for housing, and it's everything from folks at a very low income, and it's people that are very much in the actual market-driven market. And sorry, that was clumsy, but everywhere in between there's a spectrum, right, of different types and prices of housing. And one of the models that I just feel like this is one thing I feel like this group is really just blown right past is the housing trust model. And you get the opportunity with that setup to sort of fill in. So if middle housing is ADUs and dividing properties into smaller bits within existing residential zoning, what a housing trust does is it's that with the added benefit to the community of having affordability in perpetuity. And that's an important thing that I keep hearing come up from a lot of the panelists is we just want to make sure that, if we build this stuff, that it stays that way and it doesn't become market rate. Well, I totally agree with that. And I think that there's one model of that, which is a community organization, a housing authority of that sort of model, or a Rand Road thing where we build rental apartments. But if you only build that, if housing is a ladder and we're missing rungs, and we understand that from the market rate where we have rungs that are missing to get up to move up that ladder, this is the same thing with affordable housing. If we don't add in the ownership piece, where we have this great opportunity through the trust model of reining in that equity and keeping it so that the next person gets to come into that same model, they then walk away with something, not nothing. The rental model is great. It is a Band-Aid. It works fantastically to solve the immediate problem of getting people in housing who can be my employees. Totally get that. But if I have those long-term employees, where do they go next? If we don't fill in the other rungs in the ladder, we're missing an opportunity. And the best way to do that is to have some sort of housing that can allow them to sort of walk away at the end of that housing journey with something, not with the same exponential growth in their equity that folks in the market do, but something in between those things. That homeownership piece, I feel like, is really important, and I think we have groups in our community who are willing. They're trying to work with you guys to be a part of this conversation. I don't want them to be left out, in our haste to do one thing but not realize that this is a continuum. If that makes it, that's my second version of what I want council to hear.
Thanks, Nate. Other folks' thoughts? Rudy, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I've got a couple things. I really like where Nate's going with that. I'm trying to sort through some of this initial data that was presented here in the first 20, 30 slides, but I remember, I think there's, and maybe it's a percentage of MFI, metric, but how important is long-term affordability? Of course, it's very important, but can we set a goal, as we operationalize this plan, can we set a goal that, at least, 30% of the affordable housing production that is achieved using these tools is going to be long-term, defined as, 10 years plus or whatever. So I think ultimately, the technical minds should peruse the data that we have and, close in these first kind of 20, 25 pages and figure out, can we give ourselves some metrics about, percentage of units of, what flavor we're talking about should be affordable, in a longer period. I don't know what that number is, and I don't know if it's reasonable to put a number to it, but I think creating a benchmark is the most important thing. And the benchmark should come from the needs analysis that's presented at the beginning of the page of the document here.
Okay, so Rudy, you're saying it's not all or nothing. It's not like
no. I think thinking it as it's either affordable in perpetuity or it's going to be market rate next year. That, to me, that's a false choice. I think the blended approach that Nate advocates for, because it is the latter. And yeah, wouldn't it be great if everything was affordable forever? But that's unrealistic, right? I think for many reasons. I think we need to be happy with a blended approach, as long as the blend speaks to the needs that we've outlined, and with the tools, and funding sources that we have. We do have, there's a box we got to work in here, because we only have that much dirt, we only have that many dollars, and we're only going to have this many tools to throw at it. What's the best possible, optimized blend of affordability and, x-axis time here?
Thank you.
Sorry, I apologize. I was muted, didn't realize. I just wanted to tell you at one level, what you've got in Exhibit 5, the number of households, current and new, may produce the outer bounds of what you might want to think about as your goals. But producing 1,000 new dwelling units that are below 50% of median family income, that's a huge ask. And so that's not necessarily realistic. But those provide some sideboards to where you might want to start some of that thinking that you're bringing up there, Rudy. So I will unshare and hand it back to Commissioner Saunders. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. Other people aren't jumping. I'm gonna see if Karen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, maybe I have thoughts, but I have to unmute first. I still am finding that most of what I would like to hear said has already been said. I really like the idea that there's some way of moving through affordability so that you can have some equity in a home. I think we heard that very strongly in and some of the shares from other folks. And I think that that's something that everybody dreams of. So I'd like to make sure that there's something that allows that to happen.
Thank you. Kenny? Thoughts?
I mean, I think there's another thing to say about providing opportunities for moving up the ladder. And that is that there's a lot of people that could move up the ladder that are stuck in affordable units that could be freed up for people who maybe lack housing altogether or are stuck in a lower level, lower income housing. So if we're able to create more units at higher income levels, you do free up the market more for folks who want to move up or able to move up into those levels. I mean, there is some folks who aren't going to move beyond affordable housing, and they may need that in perpetuity. And I guess some of the questions around how do you ensure that perpetuity, I think whenever government is putting dollars into something, they have the ability to require that those units stay affordable for as long as they want them to stay affordable, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 99 years, they can require that. I think you have to be reasonable about it. And there's always ways to incentivize any units that come up on the end of their affordability period for continuing affordability by reinvesting dollars in those units and improving the asset again, and then you maintain longer affordability. So there's definitely ways to do that, but I think government should, they have the obligation to ensure that units are maintained as affordable for the long term. I think if you get into the private market and try and control that, you're going to run into a whole nother issue, which is private developers won't want to invest in the community anymore, so you'll constrain housing by doing that in and of itself.
Thanks, Kenny. I'm going to go to Jennifer and then go over to Nate, just to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I haven't really heard is a lot of folks who have lived in this community have been in a state of like pause in moving, whether it's moving up in the community or moving down on the income levels for years and years and years. And so that person who's been renting the same place for 10 years or 8 years or 3 years even, that there's no end goal for that person, whether that's, your income levels aren't changing, whether that's, everything else is exponentially changing faster than you have control over or you can make change for. So I think that's also part of it is there's not a lot of, there's big change and then there's a big change on the other side, but there's not a lot of incremental. And so I think that's something that I've heard a lot from community members.
I just wanted, this is all really apropos to a policy brief that I just completed with a co-op developer in Springfield. There's actually, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm just sharing my screen to show, I can send this out afterwards, but we created a housing ladder graphic that talked about the status quo approach and then a cooperative ownership approach, which allows limited equity appreciation and affordability and perpetuity. And it's directly ties into the recently adopted middle housing work in the state and has a lot of really specific implementation options for communities. So I can share this with both this group and potentially link it in our document, because it sounds like there's some interest on these types of models. It's tied in with community land trusts, but the ownership model is cooperative model and not fee simple.
Thanks, Nate. You're muted again.
Yep. What I wanted to say is I want to come back to what I want to reinforce, that the reason that I've started to think about this more so is not because of my work in real estate, but it's been because of comments from a couple of our panel members. Ubaldo, to be sure, and one of our other panel members whose name I'm blanking on right now, have both made comments throughout the early number of our meetings, which said, what happens when the income levels get better? What happens when someone who's in that lower end of, at Hood River Crossing or at one of these other Section 8 sort of situations, what if they stay in the community? And what if their income gets better? What if they become a more valuable member to the employment group they're with, and their income gets them to the point where they're now out of that? What's that next step? And I feel like we very much have the leg and the focus, set up for that very low end of that median income scale. But we've got to fill in the other ones, because if we want, as employers, I'm going to put my hat on as an employer. If I want someone to sort of, become a long-term member of my group, I want them to do better. I want to pay them more. I want to compensate them. But if their housing choices are limited in that they would be better off to not get paid more by me, that seems ridiculous. I would much rather we think about this holistically and make sure that we are filling in those gaps. And I think that the latter metaphor is apropos of both ownership and rentals. We need to be careful that we don't cut off or don't focus too much on one particular income scale, ignoring the fact that some of these people become long-term members of our community, have greater incomes as they go along, and then lose their housing because we've rewarded them by being part of our community. So let's make sure that we're careful with how we see that, and zoom out a little bit and make sure that we're addressing those different income levels. And I know that all the data shows that, and I know Beth's done a great job with that stuff, but from advice to council is, let's make sure we're careful about where our focus is, and make sure our focus is zoomed out enough to see that this is a continuum. I'm using that term again. I'm sorry, I've overworked it, but that's where I'm at on that.
Thanks, Nate. Anyone else have thoughts on this topic? Continuum, ladder, long-term affordability, guarantees, anything in that realm? Cool. I think I'm going to do everything. If we've got time, I'll do everything Jennifer suggested because they're great. But I'm going to just jump into thoughts from folks on regulating short-term rentals in the commercial zones, since that was, I feel like, newer than the GO bond we've been talking about at some level. Does anyone want to jump into that, or otherwise I'm going to call on you all? I feel like a teacher right now. But I'm going to jump to Karen, if you're cool with being first.
And you were talking about intermingling residential housing in commercial zones. Is that what I understood correctly?
No, so talking about, it sounds like there was a concern in one of the stakeholder groups that existing housing in the commercial zones, which are not currently limited in their ability to short-term rent, are being converted from long-term rentals to short-term rentals. And so there was a suggestion to regulate that in some form. And I'm wondering what you all's thoughts are on both doing that in the first place, or if there's a mechanism you'd like to see.
Councilor Saunders, I'm wondering, since this is so brand new, maybe I could do a little bit more introduction of kind of the context.
Please do.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So right now, currently the home needs to be the primary residence of the license holder if it's in a residential zone, but not in a commercial zone. Commercial zone can be a second home. Everyone needs to provide parking. And one thing that was brought up during one of the focus groups was that our existing long-term housing stock owned by a single corporation, that one corporation would be able to get licenses, an unlimited number of licenses to convert all of their apartments into short-term rentals. And so in the commercial zones. And so do we want to do something? And I think that no one's thought that was the intent behind short-term renting. So do we want to address that by limiting the ability, by say, limiting the number of licenses that any one entity can do to kind of close what could be a loophole to basically allow people to become de facto hotels without going through a land use process.
And I assume this is not unique to Hood River, right? This problem has, or this potential loophole has popped up in other places recently, yes?
White Salmon just recently talked about it in a little bit different way, but specifically what I think the potential problem is existing apartments being converted to essentially something like a hotel room through the STR license program.
Basically a self check-in hotel room. Yeah.
It is unique to Hood River because it's a loophole in Hood River's unique regulation of short-term rentals. So
right.
Will, the way you phrased it in previous discussions is one person, one short-term rental license.
Any has a question maybe or thought?
Maybe you helped answer that, Jennifer, because my question was, what was the scale of the potential problem and how many units could be impacted by that? Because that would help determine whether or not you would want to invest a lot of time in it.
Well, as I was talking with Will the other day in the office, I'll use the example of an apartment complex on Cascade Avenue. I don't remember how many units they have, but I would say 40 plus apartments at one property. But right now, it's not clearly prevented or prohibited in our code from each of those apartments getting licensed as a short-term rental.
So it could be large.
Could be large.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say,
we don't have a full inventory, but I think using one example of dozens of apartments at one property is reason enough in my mind.
I'm going to just jump in of, and we've been talking about council has a lot of overlapping and sometimes working together types of things. When we've been talking about housing in the past, there's always been the discussion of we need to be doing more mixed use housing in commercial zones, more multifamily in commercial zones, since that is the place to do that high density housing. And so I think we have existing, apartments, as Jennifer and Dustin were mentioning, but also like, if that's a direction we're trying to promote more of, you're potentially creating more of that same concern if they're not going to be used for long-term housing.
And we potentially can deal with prospective projects during the approval process by putting some limitations on it through the approval process, which is maybe not the easiest way to do that in terms of tracking long-term, but for the existing multifamily development, we don't have a tool in place right now.
Nate, Rudy? Sorry.
Two quick points. Number one, one of the things that we found out when we did our existing residential our existing STR regulation scheme was that the problem went on too long, created an entrenched group of folks who wanted to fight it. Right now, there is very little of the C1 sort of residential and C2 residential that exists. We haven't really built out that mixed use sort of inventory. If you're going to make changes, do it now before there's an entrenched constituency who wants to make money off of it. My second point is I will tell you right now, with the limited number of residential units in the C1 zoning, I have a very specific example with something that I'm involved with right now, which is that the difference between a downtown property in the R2 or R3 zoning and one in the C2 is seemingly, as the market sees it right now, about $200,000 greater value in the one in the C1 zoning because of that unlimited ability to do the short-term rentals, outside of that 90 days a year. So I don't know if that's an accurate number. It seems it is to the current situation that I'm in, but I really can't stress enough that if you want to make changes as council to something like the C1 and C2, do it now before we've really built out a lot of mixed use and really have a lot of units where people have got their they've got their outlook for the return on investment, because you know what the fight looked like the last time with the legacy STR holders when we tried to change it in the residential zones.
Rudy?
Yeah, and totally, do it now. And second of all, look, the STR thing had a big impact. I think we all agree. And if there's a hole in it, we need to fix it, right? I think it would be silly to move forward with all these other complex, expensive and bandwidth eating projects, and then at the same time leave a loophole open that potentially can get exploited to the I don't think it looks good either, right? It looks like we're not looking at it holistically, and the reality is, you having an apartment in C1 is not a hotel. Are you paying hotel tax? Okay, then Dustin should permit another hotel somewhere in town if we need more hotel rooms. These are not hotel rooms; they're apartments. So I think that's something that's worthwhile. I think politically it's worthwhile to take on, because I think it's also not a good look to leave a big opening and start, and chase these new things. We've got to close all the holes that are exposed, especially if this is real.